Hello again, everybody. Don Stevens here, HorseManDon on the HorseManDon YouTube channel. I'm joined by a couple of dear friends of mine who you will not believe have never actually met. My mentor, Jim Byers, who I met in the mid-'90s up at Remington Park, actually at a sports casting camp, and then Michael Chamberlain, who I now work with for the last 5 years here in Louisiana, different tracks, but we're kind of fellow, if you will. Anyway, Michael, Jim, Michael. First time you met, huh?
Yeah,
nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. We've semi-crossed paths. I mean, I know I briefly worked at Fairmeadows in Tulsa. You passed through there at one point, but
I did a summer there too. Yes.
Yeah, but this is the first though that we've actually conversed.
Yep. All right. So I've got two of the greatest minds in horse race calling, if you will. I'm going to take a back seat and just host this thing right now. But Jim, met back in the 90s at Remington Park. You were the announcer. Back then, racing was a little different. We weren't on a camera between races. We weren't really handicapping. We just call a race and we wait. And when I came in after I met you, you had me go out and I would record on a tape recorder and come in, and you were nice enough to put it in a VHS tape player and watch it, turn down your sound, listen to me, and coach me. So I learned under you. So I think I have a lot of your attributes, and of course I thank you for that. But let's get into actually calling the race, because that's what this video is all about. Jim, let's start with you. Like 15 minutes before a race and before they come out on the track, how do you prep?
Well, these days, like you guys, I offer handicapping selections. I do a pre-race seminar. I don't handicap at Lone Star Park race by race like you guys do. I'm not part of that preview show. But so now I'm more familiar with them when they step on the track than I was 20, 30 years ago pre-handicapping. In those old days, we were probably busier as track announcers from the time we got there till the time we left than we are today. The difference was there was no handicapping, but the load of PA announcements was much greater. Promotions, PA announcements, ceremonies, those all ran through the booth. Operationally, you were much more involved in the production than you are today. Now you're pretty much calling the races. And so the 15 minutes has changed a little bit. But for me, the very first thing I do, I try to watch them in the paddock as much as I can. Nowadays, we have better access to paddock views than we had in the old days. I try to get an idea of the silks, refresh myself if they're older claiming horses, familiarize myself if they're newer horses. When they come on the track, spend 2 or 3 minutes really into the post parade, looking at them, checking out the riders, and then just warming them up periodically as they go to the gate. Spend a couple minutes through the binoculars, stare at them, take a minute or two off, and then that's basically how I do it. I now do color up the program with colored markers, which I never did before. In fact, when I was younger, it was kind of, I wouldn't say frowned upon, but it wasn't something that you really wanted to do. But now I love it, and I don't know how to call a race without it. I don't use the colors much during the running of the race, but it helps me beforehand. And then just kind of follow them to the gate.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because when I learned under you, you didn't do a lot of coloring. And today I don't do a lot of coloring at all. One thing I do, which I got from you, was if a horse in the post parade has like a white shadow roll that really sticks out that I might see across the track, I'll mark like an upside down U next to the number. Or if they're wearing front wraps or something, I might put a little note of that. So I kind of got that from you. And my rolling rider Pentel red pens. Remember how
you took that up from me. I've changed my pen brand. I now use a gel pen by Pilot.
Wow. Okay, Michael, so take us through your 15 minutes up till post time.
Well, as you learned under Jim, I actually learned Don at the foot of Luke Kreitbos, who was unfortunately no longer with us. But he taught me how to call a race as good as anybody, because he was one of the best. And he was a colorer. If you ever were in his booth at Turf Paradise when he was there, the floor was littered with crayons. There was we're talking like the Crayola factory rejects. They were in that room. And they were broken, and he was a devoted colorer, and I actually have an old program page of mine here.
Oh, there you go.
I have where I colored over each of the horses' names with the particular silks that they're going to be wearing in that particular race. So if I were to look at the program and see red for number one is Sense of Duty. and prior to each race. And I have done this since I started out in Houston. I memorize those colors and those names together. And, and as they come out on the track, I'll take a good look at them as they come out in the post parade, make sure the silks that I have in the book are the silks that they have on the jockey's back, because sometimes they come out in different colors. So you got to be sure that you have the right silks in your program, so you know when you're looking for a particular horse in a particular color, that will match up with each.
Yeah, I've never looked at what the program says just because of program errors and things. I've never looked at that. Always come on the track or in the paddock, so that's true. I got to ask you guys, with horse names, now, we've all been in the booth with other announcers and stuff, and quietly we're whispering the name of the horse over and over as we're looking through our binoculars. Do you guys ever do word association? Because I did that from the very beginning. If a horse is wearing pink and it has something about a lady or a princess, that will stick in my head, and I do word association. Do you guys do it? Have you ever done that, Jim?
I try not to. I don't know if you were at the track at Remington when I threw in an accidental Jeffrey Dahmer one.
Oh, I just thought about that.
Yeah. There's a horse named Jeffrey D, and somehow and I wasn't even aware that I was doing it, but in my warm-up process, somehow the name Dahmer, I finished off the name for some reason, and it came out once in the call. And so, no, I try not to use mnemonic devices because I'm afraid they're going to slip into the call. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but I have tended to steer clear of them, especially since the Jeffrey Dahmer incident.
Yeah. Well, it was in the news at the time. But did he put in a killer performance, or should I not say that?
Oh.
Anyway, let's go to Mike.
Oh, my goodness. That was colder than his refrigerator, for heaven's sake.
Oh, man.
Well, Michael, I have to ask you, do you use any of the word association or not?
I try to stay away from that, mainly for the same reason that Jim cited there, is that I could accidentally mention the word association in the race call. But what I do is, if there's a name that particularly might stick out in a race, and I did this a couple of times to great fanfare out of Turf Paradise. There was a horse there, two of them. I'll use the examples. One was named Nudge Nudge Wink Wink, in honor of the Monty Python sketch. And I did adapt the Monty Python accent, calling the horse all the way through. I nudge, nudge, wink, wink, sign them all, And the owner of the horse actually hunted me down and said, "Thank you for doing that," because that was exactly the reaction we wanted to get when we named the horse that. And the other one I do recall more vividly was a horse named Hey Sarah Sarah.
Right.
That was actually, and I don't even know how I looked this up that morning. It just didn't. I came across on my computer feed that the particular day the horse was running was Doris Day's birthday.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So as the horse is winning the race, I break out into song and start singing, "Hey Sarah Sarah," and I actually it took off for a little bit for that day, because Matt Carruthers was on TVG, and the race happened to be shown, and he must have replayed that I don't know how many times, and it actually was a pretty big little deal that day that happened. But I'll try to do stuff like that, where I try to add a little entertaining flair to a race call if I see something where, and I know that we had one here in Louisiana too, Don, Old Black Magic.
I was just thinking.
Brent Della Hussein. I did that when the horse won. I waited the whole meet for the horse to win so I could do it. And then when I ran into him at Delta following that, he said that how much he enjoyed that.
Yeah. Well, I know we all have watched the great announcers over time, and like Tom Durkin doesn't call anymore, but Jim, you have stories about him coming out to Hollywood in '80 Cup, and you always told me about the pages and pages of preparation and things. All that stuff that came out of him in the stretch was all pre-prepared, and it's hard sometimes. You don't know what's going to happen. At Remington, or not at Remington, but at Delta one time during the jackpot, Rise Up won the race in 2013, and I didn't know he was going to win, but at that time we were talking about that race, playing into the Kentucky Derby, 2-year-olds going on, getting points, I think was at the time, and I had the line prepared, and he won by. And I said, air up the tires, gas up the tank. He's on the road to the Derby. It's just something I prepared ahead of time. It may sound corny to some guys, but I'm like Michael, I want to throw there. Now, I know, Jim, you're more of the nuts and bolts, just the facts man type of announcer, aren't you?
Yeah, I certainly was in my earlier days, at Hollywood Park. I mean, I had the privilege of working out there when I was really too young to fully make use of it or appreciate it. And Marge Everett, the boss out there, did not like announcers who tended toward grandstanding or self-aggrandizement. And even in the early days of Remington, I was really, really buttoned down and straight-laced. I've gotten looser as time has gone by, and I think my years doing play-by-play when I was out of horse racing, you get a little more flexible and deal with different things. I've never had the opportunity necessarily to break into song or anything like that, just because it hasn't actually happened. But I am much more loose these days than I used to be. But I do think you have to have a little fun sometimes. And as far as the scripting things, that was always Durkin's thing. I mean, he talked about that. He made no secret of it. And he left behind a notebook in the booth in Hollywood that I still have to this day. There isn't a lot in it. But one of the things were like a brazen display of speed that he had handwritten. And little things like that. I think those can be very effective. And your stretch call, I think it's a fine line, but I think it kind of needs to be done today. I think you kind of need to be a little more prepared today. More people are hearing your call on TV than they ever used to. We used to be live event callers, and some of that stuff got lost in the PA, but not anymore. Now people are watching it at home or on their tablets or whatever. And I think that now we need to be a little more prepared for stretch calls. So I think it's the style now, and I'm fine with that, to have some stuff in, kind of loaded up and ready just in case.
Yeah. And the other point with that, Jim, as well, is not only are more people listening on the internet, but more people are active on the internet with social media. Yeah. And if you are to, if we all make mistakes. I mean, everyone makes a mistake doing whatever job they do. But, when we make a mistake or something like that, you can guarantee that there'll be someone out there on Twitter or on Facebook that's just going to say, wow, did he mess that up? Or, the best advice I ever got was my first year at Houston when I was just starting out. Dave Johnson came in for a seminar, and he looked at me and he said, you're going to make mistakes. You've got to just forget about them and move on. And that was the best piece of advice I ever got. Took me a while to accept it and realize I wasn't going to be Mr. Perfect every time. But it was really the best advice I ever got. And it's something I give credit to him every time I do make a mistake. I'm just like, okay, next one's coming up.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I remember Jim in the booth, not to give away any of your secrets or anything, but 2 years there when I was your backup and understudy. And I think it's particularly when you were starting to handicap a few races. You did that for a few years and then you quit. I saw a few red pins throw across the room. You were really perfect. Mess something up. It just burned you up. And it was hard to forget, wasn't it?
It really was. I mean, it is, it's one thing, like they say golfers need to have short memories. And if you shank one, I mean, I'm talking, tour players, not people like me. The best golfers have almost no memory. They hit a bad shot, and then the next shot is they're right back on the beam. We have to be like that too, because you cannot in my early days, people knew when I walked out if I had a problem in the third race, but I quickly learned you got to try to put it behind you. But yes, the handicapping, what would you say, frustrations, which still will occasionally creep in. Now I handicap every race. Yeah. But the handicapping frustrations of that 94, 95 era definitely led to some colorful moments inside the padded walls of the booth. I'm not ashamed to say, but it shows you're taking it serious.
And they were padded walls at Remington.
Yeah,
we had that.
Literally, I say that literally.
The walls, yeah. Unlike the early years when there wasn't a wall, they were just building it, and you were calling the race with a press box right next to you, weren't you?
Briefly, yeah. When they built the place, it was a fishbowl. There was glass on all sides. There was just a window to the press box. Now, I've since worked in booths where press box can see, and it doesn't bother me so much. But this Remington's the very, very beginning was very much a fishbowl, and they eventually closed some of it in, put up soundproofing, which was nice. They've replaced that soundproofing, by the way. The old stuff would literally fall apart, and some of it's probably still embedded in my lungs. But that stuff was like molting right off the wall. But now they have really nice new soundproofing.
Yeah, it's great.
It's really nice.
Okay. Now, I could talk to you guys all day, but now I want to talk to you about the race itself. Okay, you talked about your preparation. I did the same thing. You looked at the binoculars, memorized. Now at Delta, it's a little easier simply because it's a small track. Everything's really close. They wear obviously saddlecloth colors and cap colors, which makes it a lot easier. They don't wear colored caps at Lone Star, right? I mean, coordinating.
No, not even for the quarters.
Yeah,
which makes it a little more challenging, but.
Yeah, it makes it challenging. But once they go into the gate, of course, we know horses are unpredictable. Things can happen in the gate, or when the gate pops open, a horse can stumble. A 1 to 9 shot can come away and go to his nose, and that changes the whole complexion of the race, or the only speed away. What goes through your mind when they come away and that opening quarter mile kind of setting them up? Are you guys, how much do you use TV? Of course, if it's a mile or longer race, you probably watch them come right by you in front. But set up that first quarter mile and coming out of the gate. Well, let's give Michael a chance first.
Well, normally, for any kind of a sprint race or anything like that, I'm focused through the binoculars, looking down the backstretch and going through the field, trying to make sure I get everybody in, which is always paramount importance to get everybody a mention. And, when you get, usually through that first quarter of a mile, you can get through the field pretty quickly. And, I always like to make note of the time. I know not every announcer does give the time, but I mean, there are more of us that do than don't. And I even changed it over from going to, 22 and a fifth to 22.22 now, like you do, Don, with the way the
I got complaints. Now everybody seems to do
it,
but
yeah, and even Larry Colmus was doing it. He's doing it on the NBC for the national race call too. So and I think as long as you can get through the field once, and then you can get to the nuts and bolts of what the race is going to do after that, because you give everybody a mention, and usually, like I can maybe get through a smaller field, maybe 8 to 10 horses. I can get through a second time before they get into the stretch and things really start to develop. But I'm more worried about getting everyone a mention in that early part of the race, setting up how fast they're going, whether or not that pace is too hot for the front runners and could set things up for a closer or something like that. So there's a lot that goes into the earlier part of the race, from my perspective, than sometimes goes into the later part of the race, because sometimes that pace will fall apart, sometimes it won't, and the speed holds up all the way through. So it's the early part of the race, I think, always sets up the remaining.
So how?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a handicapper in LA whose opinion I really respected, Jerry Antonucci, told me when I was first calling the races that and he watched thousands of races a year, was the most important part of the call for him was really the first quarter to 3/8 of a mile. That the stretch call is where announcers kind of get to show off a little, and that's when we perform. But the start of the race is really important, because that sets it up for handicappers and people critically watching the race. Right. Where your horses are. So I've always tried to put a premium on that. There's no doubt that in a two-turn race, I will obviously, a two-turn race that starts right in front of us, I'll look without binoculars. Sometimes the binoculars can bring you in too close. You don't want to be in, you can miss things if you're.
Well, and nowadays you have those really good expensive binoculars, don't you?
Well, yeah, I went to what I call the Larry Colmus binoculars. He popularized these on Twitter. Frank Marinati uses these. I haven't met Frank either. I've corresponded with him. I don't know Larry. I haven't met him, but several, Travis Stone, I believe, use
Travis
these.
has those. I've seen Travis's. I know those.
Yeah, these are Canon image stabilizing 15 powers. There's a button here you press to stabilize the image. They run on batteries. Got to make sure your battery doesn't run out. I've had the battery run out in the middle of a race before. And then the image gets shaky. Any shakiness at all in your hands will be reflected. But nonetheless, don't use binoculars for about the first 16th of a mile. Don't use the binoculars either for the final 16th or so of a mile of a traditional race. And one time I tried to think to myself, when do I quit using the binoculars? Because I literally bring them down without being aware of it. It's just all of a sudden.
I agree.
Right. I think it's roughly coming to the 16th pole.
Yeah.
But and only once in a great while at night on the turf, and you guys might experience this, especially Michael or Don, when you're at Evangeline, me at Lone Star, the turf can get a little dark late at night and they're farther away. Yeah. Occasionally I'll go back to them if I'm just wanting to make sure I'm accurate. But yeah, binoculars up, set the race up. I'm much more normally acutely aware of the pace scenario on the 2-turn races than the sprints, but definitely keep an eye. I've gone back and forth on doing fractions. West Coast based callers, people who grew up like I did. Trevor never gave a fraction. Harry Henson didn't. Vic doesn't. John Lees doesn't usually do fractions. Miramati, anybody who's from LA basically doesn't do fractions.
I wonder why that is. That's interesting.
I don't know. A lot of us out there kind of felt like Dave Johnson didn't do them when he was at Santa Anita. A lot of people out there thought it was a harness thing. Initially, in the 70s and early 80s, harness callers did it. Marshall Cassidy did it in New York, quite dramatically, I might add. But thoroughbred guys like Durkin that did harness also did it. Just kind of a West Coast thing. But I do pay good attention to the board. Right. And try to keep in mind the pace scenario, because Michael's right. The finish of the race, you're only calling the horses you need to call. Right. The early part's the real nuts and bolts, and when you get guest callers that come in or radio guys or people that kind of joke around with the call, they always struggle at the beginning. Some of them can bring them home okay because they're right there, but it's that start that's the key.
Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the finish of the race. I know you guys kind of talked about the stretch call, but what I think is interesting for the fans to hear, and especially you guys have called it, you guys have actually called a lot more tracks, I think, than I have. Only have called it 5 racetracks in my whole career, a race. The old Evangeline Downs, new Evangeline Downs, Delta Downs, Blue Ribbon Downs, and Remington Park. I think that's the only 5 I've called that. You guys have probably called many more than that. So you have more experience. And I'm interested, especially about Tulsa Fair Meadows, but maybe some other tracks. Give me an interesting story about a track you called that you were way before or after the finish line and it was challenging or tough. I know when I came to Delta, I was way past the finish line. And you've been to Delta, Jim, and you too, Michael. You're right up on the racetrack. So it makes it even more you're past or before the finish line. So it was difficult to me to adjust from Remington, where I was high and way back and almost on the line. So Jim, tell me about an interesting story about being on or before the line or after, how that works.
Well, oddly enough, like I've called races at about 10 or 11 tracks, at least one race. Almost every booth that I can remember, I was a little bit before the line. My vantage point has been very similar. I've never been in a vantage point where I'm like, whoa, this is bizarre. Fair Meadows and Tulsa, obviously, I only did 10 days there. I did not do the whole meet. Jesse Euler was the announcer then, and he was away at auctioneer school, and I filled in. But Fair Meadows, you literally shared a wall with the photo finish. Now, this is the old grandstand that's been torn down now. I don't know what I have now. Right. That was the best view. And Sam Houston, which Michael's much more familiar with than I did, because oddly enough, I did 10 days at Houston as well. Great vantage point.
Very low.
Very low.
Yes,
you're low and you're
very
close,
low.
right on the line, which I thought the lowness was great for judging finishes. I don't really have a weird story about the finish, except I will say Lone Star's booth is the best booth I've ever been in as far as comfort, the view of the overall track. Yeah. But the last 50 yards at Lone Star is a struggle. And I'm not saying that to be, make excuses, but the view of the finish, I don't know if it's the angle of the building, the height, where we are in relation to the finish. I actually think maybe the placement of the mirror is an issue at Lone Star. I have a hard time with close finishes. I peek at my monitor frequently because it's the hardest place to call close finishes. That of the main tracks I've been to are Hollywood and Remington. I mean, I've called races at 10 or 11 places, but many of those as fill-ins. So I don't really have a lot of weird experiences. I just, day in, day out, Remington was the easiest of the 3 main tracks I've worked at to call finishes. I think it was the truest vantage point. Lone Star's vantage point. I love the place and I love the booth, but man, finishes can be rocky there.
What about real quick? What about light conditions? Because I know you've called out at what, Del Mar, Los Al. Those are tough. It's twilight.
Yeah, I called a Del Mar in '83. I called one race a day, and I always called the last race. And now when I watch those tapes back, or I watch the last race from Del Mar, that sun, of course, Del Mar faces north, so that sun is just straight in your eyes. But I was 23. I didn't know the difference. Los Al too. I mean, thankfully, I did Los Al almost exclusively harness, just a little bit of other stuff. And again, it was pretty much night racing by time they started up. Los Al, though, can be tricky. I never worked there a lot in the summer when the sun was real low. And I've never had a problem really with lighting at the finish. Stretch call, yes. And even Lone Star faces northeast.
Yeah.
So in June, when that sun is hanging, I have to put paper up in the window just to keep the sun out of my eyes. The silks get very silhouetted, but never had a problem with lighting really at the finish, even at night. Been lucky there.
Michael, what about you? What about finishes and where you're at in the booth?
Well, the one that was actually the trickiest for me, and especially for turf races, was Turf Paradise, because it is ahead of the finish line. So the dirt track, obviously being closer to me, was a different story than the turf track being further away. I miscalled several stakes races, several turf races, including a stakes race, because I was so far ahead of the finish line up there that it looked to me like one horse won clearly, when the photo obviously showed the other horse winning. And, I had to go out and apologize to, a couple of the horsemen and saying, I'm sorry, I got you all excited that you won, and you didn't, but Turf Paradise was a tough one, just in terms of being ahead of the finish line. Jim, you mentioned that booth in Houston, which is right on the finish line, but we mentioned it being so low that the issue that you get there, especially on the turf there, is the lighting on the turf course is not the best. So when they're spread 3-4 across the racetrack out there, those horses in the middle, you need to know who's there. Because if you lose them, or they're a smaller horse and you can't see the jockey or the silks saddle towel, it's very tough to be accurate in those kind of circumstances. So those are the two that mainly stand out for me. I mean, the booth at Evangeline is terrific. It's enormous. The bay window out there, and it's all glass and everything. And it really is a very good booth for calling a race. Lots of space.
Michael, be serious now.
Well, yeah. And the other thing about Turf Paradise was it was about as big as a broom closet. And it literally, I mean, if you have a couch, from one end of the couch to the other end of the couch, that was about as long as the room was, So, the booth here at Evangeline is one of the best ones that I've called out of, and I've called out of countless booths in Nebraska, Oklahoma. I did all 3 racetracks in Texas: Lone Star, Retama, and Sam Houston, obviously. And I have done Louisiana Downs and Delta and Evangeline here in Louisiana. Have not done the fairgrounds with John Dooley doing a great job over there, obviously. You mentioned harness racing, Jim, and I did a meet at Vernon Downs up in upstate New York one summer back in 2014. Now that is probably the, how shall I say this, the oldest booth that I've called in, because that building was built way, way back, and the track's been standing up there since the 50s. And it's still the original. I mean, the staircase to get up there is quite the experience to make sure you can get up there okay. But it really is, some booths are better than others, and it's just that simple. And some tracks have actually thought it through. And one other quick one I mentioned, the booth at Churchill Downs. I called the race there back in 2006 when they did All-Star Announcers Day at the Breeders' Cup. And the way they had it set up at the time, and I'm not sure if they've changed this or not since they've done some renovations or whatever, but when you look down to the top of the stretch, the horses disappear because the glass from each successive booth or suite form a prism where the horses just go into that prism and they're gone. So if you recall, It happened to Trevor Denman when Street Sense won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. It happened to Tom Durkin when Mind That Bird won the Derby. Mm-hmm. And I remember, because that race that I called there, I remember it happening to me too. And I remembered who was there, who was winning when the horses came back out of the view that I could see. So that was definitely a help. So those particular race calls, which everyone, has bashed online, it was really unfair because it wasn't a bad race call. It was just a bad setup, which caused that, because the horses just disappear on you. It's just a weird thing to happen.
Yeah, that's a very sinking feeling when there's some sort of an impediment, regardless. And I've been lucky. Remington and Hollywood and Lone Star all are impediment free, but I have worked in some booths where you had to dodge around either a window support or, Oaklawn Park, where I filled in the last 2 years, there is a trick at the top of the stretch. There is a support pole. The view is fine, but there is a beam to your left that you have to look on one. You have to look on one side of it in the upper stretch at about the quarter pole, or you are staring with your binoculars right into a beam if you don't do it. When I went back in 19, I forgot the very first race when I did the last race for Vic one day, the first day when he was still there, and I covered the last race. I forgot you have to make a pretty dramatic step to the right when they hit the top of the stretch. Otherwise, you're looking at this beam. Well, I forgot to do it. And so I'm like, oh, man. And I remembered, because it had been a year since I'd been there. And then I got in the right spot. And sure enough, some horse slipped up the rail, not, Mind That Bird but still, I was a little slow picking up this come from behind her because I totally lost the field. It's kind of like those rare moments, the guy gets stung by a bee or the wind, and all of a sudden you're watching a race and the pan shot just goes away. It's that disoriented feeling.
Yeah.
I have a quick question for Jim about Hollywood Park real quick before we wrap up, Don. Jim, you called it Hollywood Park back in the 80s. Was that when they had the two separate finish lines? And did they have two separate booths at that time too?
Yeah, they did. Oh, that was too much for a guy in his mid-20s working for Mount Everett to handle. Yes, when I started, Harry Henson had a booth right on the finish line at the very top that ended up being the placing judge's booth. By the time I got there, I was in the old pan camera booth, a couple of lengths before the finish line. Nice setup. It remained the booth until the end. But in 84 in the fall, they had the first Breeders' Cup, and they expanded the track, had a second finish line, which became the only finish line for a while. And NBC put up a little plywood shack at the end of the roof, right at the edge. It was not very safe. And we converted that. After NBC abandoned this little tiny shack, I asked for 1985, I asked, could we set up PA down there and I'll go back and forth. They ran generally the turf races to the original booth, main track to the other, for the most part. They said, sure. So I actually called a season's worth of races in this little shack that Durkin used to call a Breeders' Cup. And it's one thing to call, in those days, 7 races in one day from your little temporary shack. It's another to call every race, every day, all weather conditions. So anyway, we did that. And then they started going back and forth. And eventually, by 87, my last year, I think I was back in the regular booth the whole time. But yeah, it wasn't as bad as at Keeneland and Oaklawn and places where they run races to a different finish line, and you have to watch the remainder of the race on TV because there isn't another booth. At least there isn't at Oaklawn to go to the other finish line for, because it finishes essentially at the 16th hole. Wasn't quite like that at Hollywood, but it was complicated. Yeah, the different booths were complicated.
Well, one more question. I got one more question before we go, Don. Jim, when you were at Hollywood Park in the 80s, did you ever get to meet Cary Grant?
No, actually, I never did. I never met any stars. We would hear that they were there. But no, I never met him. I know one day Michael Jackson was there. I didn't see any.
Because Cary Grant, I believe, was on the board of directors at that time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. I met John Forsythe. He was also on the board.
Hey. Okay.
I think I met him, possibly. Didn't meet any real A-listers, though, other than that. I mean, Elizabeth Taylor was a good friend of Marge Everett. Never met her. But no, unfortunately, I didn't mingle much downstairs back then. I was not a big man on campus at Hollywood. For a guy on the PA, I kept a very low profile.
Gotcha.
You never met Jack Klugman, huh?
Never met Jack Klugman. I would love to have met some of these people.
Yeah.
But met Tim Conway.
Oh, yeah.
When he came to Remington.
Okay.
Everybody's probably met Tim Conway. That was in the sport in the 90s.
Yeah.
But met Tom Poston and Tim Conway at Remington.
Nice.
Never met a big movie star, though.
Okay. Well, I got two quick questions, and I know we can talk all day, but this is a lot of fun for me. Okay. Between the three of us, I know I've estimated between Remington and here in 20, when did I become the announcer? 99 after you, Jim, yeah. And then back up before that. So 21 years for me, lots of years for you guys. So I probably call between 20 and 30,000 races just to guesstimate. You guys probably have that many or many. I know Jim has many more than that. But you were out of the sport for a while, Jim, so yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So can you give me, out of all that, just off the top of your head, one race that stands out for any reason, not just a big race or a big horse, or you thought you nailed it, or it was most exciting, or whatever? Can you give me one race from all those years of calling that stands out in your mind for any reason?
Want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I got to go back to 84. A lot of the time that I was at Hollywood was a kind of a blur now. I mean, it's so long ago. And 84, I have some video from, but we didn't do a replay show then. So I've seen some of the stakes races back, but the first Hollywood Gold Cup I ever called, John Henry was in the race. He ran third, as I recall. But at that point, he was obviously good on dirt, but he was horse of the year in 84 at 9 years of age as a turf horse. Right. And I got to call him in a couple turf races, but I think the Gold Cup was the most special. It was the centerpiece race of the meet. I remember what I felt like when I walked in. I remember what the weather and the air looked like. And one of my favorite horses, Desert Wine, won the race. That's probably my number one as far as my favorite when I, think about, what's a good memory from there. Yeah. And, it gives short shrift to Remington and Lone Star because I've had a lot of great memories there. But being that early in my career, that would be it.
Yeah, a call for you that stands out for me was Clever Trevor, just because I was so into it. I was a fan at the time. He won the first Remington Park Derby. I know he ran in the Kentucky Derby, and he was a good regional horse. He wasn't national, but for Donnie Von Hemel, he was a coming out horse for him. Michael, what's down?
The one race that stands out for me actually is that race I called the Churchill Downs in 2006 as part of All-Star Announcers Day. But the reason it stands out is a little different because the horse that won, it was just a run-of-the-mill claiming race, going field of 12, going a mile of 16th at Churchill Downs. The horse that won the race was named Kathleen. And Kathleen, a couple of years later, ends up in Nebraska. It had run race, obviously it, started getting older and was, sold off and ended up running in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I became the announcer for a couple of summers when I first got the job at Turf Paradise. I needed something for the summer. I ended up in Lincoln, Nebraska. And when I was looking and handicapping the races and I saw Kathleen, where have I heard that name before? And then I remembered, oh my goodness, this is the horse that won the race I called at Churchill Downs back in 07. And for the horse to still be going, 5-6 years later, and the horse was still winning at, Lincoln, Nebraska, and a smaller circuit like that. That was a horse that, obviously has a special place for me. Wasn't any fabulous, horse or anything like that, but just won a few races here and there, and I just happened to be around for.
Well, for me, I think it would have to be 99 when I called my first Remington Park Derby, Temperance Time. Do you remember that, Jim?
Yeah. Very much.
Jacked up. I mean, I know you were teaching me everything about racing. We knew John Brooks, who was a great announcer in Oklahoma with the Oklahoma Sooners and all that, and really had to learn about when to get up during a race, and when to get your voice up. And I think I was up at the top level for the whole stretch, So we did have we had a 2-year-old Eclipse Award winner in there, Answer Lively, who ran second. And, it was my first big race. It was graded, I think, wasn't it? 99, I think it was grade 3. And then,
yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, and then of course it became the Oklahoma Derby now, and then of course at Delta, my first $1 million race, the first jackpot, when I first came here, 3 weeks after I got here, thrown in, didn't know the place. 3 weeks later, and Mr. Jester wins the jackpot. Still says that to me all the time. He gets a kick out of how up I was, at the wire for that. And then of course the horses that went on to big things like Big Drama and Tepin, Exaggerator, not Exaggerator, but what's his name?
Yeah, who was that? The Mud Freak.
Yeah, the Mud.
Yes, the one who won the Preakness. Yes.
Yeah, Exaggerator. Yeah, exactly. So those horses, obviously stand out for me. But those are great stories, guys. One final question, and don't take long to answer it because we've already gone 41 minutes here. The other one is, as an announcer, before you, or even during your career as an announcer, who would you say your favorite announcer was to watch and listen to over the years, anytime, way back? If you know, speak up right away. If not, think about it. I don't know.
I got mine. I can tell you. I'm a Chick Anderson guy.
Okay.
When I was a kid watching the races on TV, Chick Anderson was the man, and I did not see the Belmont for Secretariat. Obviously, I was only 3 years old, so I don't remember that. But I remember watching, in the mid 70s, 75, 76, 77, and those. He was always on TV calling the big races. He was always professional and terrific. And I still remember to this day, they interrupted the CBS Sports Spectacular the day he passed away and put his picture up and said, CBS announcer Chick Anderson passing away I think he was only 47 years old, I believe. Yeah, he had a heart attack and passed away. And I was just devastated back then. And, and I always have just been the biggest fan of Chick Anderson. And, if they ever open up the Hall of Fame to racetrack announcers, I got to think he'd be part of the first class.
Yeah. Now you grew up in New Jersey, right, Michael?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. He worked the NYRA circuit for a couple of years before he passed away too. As a matter of fact, he was calling the races the first time I ever went to Belmont Park.
Wow. Cool. All right, Jim. I got to know.
Well, I'm going to go with Dave Johnson. Even though Harry Henson was the first man that I ever backed up, and Harry called me at home one time when I was getting out of college and wrote him a letter saying, how can I break into the business? Very nice to me and very supportive. And I loved Harry Henson, loved his style. But Dave Johnson, to me, just epitomized the big moments. He had a good background in the sport, in that he had worked at smaller tracks, and yet he could also step down and host things, which was unusual back then. Most track announcers were people pulled from the grandstand back in the old days that just could get through the race. Like Michael, I do admire Chick Anderson. I wasn't as familiar with his work, pretty much only watched the Triple Crown races with him. I, too, remember being shocked when I read, I was in college at the time. I'm obviously the oldest of our triumvirate.
Yeah.
But remember when he passed away as well. But Dave, to me, who was also influential in my career in the early days, would probably be it for me as far as a foundational guy that I enjoyed listening to.
Yeah, I've become a good friend with Dave because he came here with Bill Finley doing the jackpot starting in 2010. And I just tell you, the guy is a super nice guy. A few years ago when we had a hurricane down here, the one that flooded Houston, I don't remember the name of the hurricanes. Which one? The Harvey? I think it was.
Harvey,
yeah. We didn't get it here in Louisiana like they got it in Texas, like 50 inches or really didn't affect me here too much 30 miles into Louisiana, but I remember getting an email from him and he said, are you and your family okay? And if you need a place to stay, come to New York City and I'll put you up for a few weeks. I mean, that's how nice this guy is. Yeah. And I said, no, we're fine. We didn't get flooded here, but Dave's a class act and he's quite a character. And I remember watching those Triple Crown races with him. And so I'd say he'd have to be one of my favorites. I do respect Tom Durkin a lot just because I love his preparedness and, the things he came up with are just, will stand out over time in the horse racing business. But anyway, well, we've gone a lot longer than I thought we would go. But
we always do.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we got because you guys have never met. And, you know, this is kind of weird about this quarantine thing or this isolation thing is, you know, we're actually talking to people more. Michael and I are talking probably when we work at our tracks, and Jim and I, we text back and forth. I know Michael knows a lot of announcers, so we'll try to get them on. And Jim, we'd like to have you. You know so much about so many. I was thinking the other day, Jim, do you remember the hockey game we did? This is off subject, but a hockey game we went to when you were calling hockey up in Tulsa, and we were driving back to Oklahoma City. And you're a Toyota, I think you had at the time.
The Maxima.
Maxima, a Nissan Maxima. And we were listening to George Carlin. You remember that?
I do. I very much do.
Concert the other night here that I hadn't seen just a year or two before he passed away. I mean, he looked a lot older, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
But we were just cracking up in the car and just, you know, the friendship announcer. We don't get to see each other very often. You know, we're in our booths in different parts of the country, and now we have this technology, and I think it's awesome. So I think I'm going to do more videos like this and get you guys involved, and let's get some announcers, some other personalities, and have a lot of fun for it. But I want to thank you guys for your time. This is the HorseManDon YouTube channel. Everybody subscribe, hit the little bell next to the subscribe button so you get alerts when we make these videos and put them up. And Jim, so nice to see you. I love your set. I'm going to have to work on mine because you're putting us to shame. Nice there.
Oh, that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah. And Michael, you and I probably in a few days going to do another video maybe on an upcoming race and maybe do another Sports Sphere show. So thank you so much. I got to love the hat. You know, tell everybody the tat again, Toronto.
We have a world champion Toronto Raptors NBA basketball hat. That's our pick tonight.
I've got my Pennsylvania Derby hat given to me, a super fan of Delta Downs, Robin. She's made the trip down to Delta twice, and she gave me a Pennsylvania. And, of course, I got to represent here my Seahawks, of course. So we got to get some flair, sports flair on you next time anyway.
Yeah, I'm not much of a hat guy, but I've got a few hats in the closet. That,
Well, another thing I know, Michael's a big golf guy, too. You're still into golf, Jim?
I'm into it. I haven't played much in the last few years.
But I mean, you're pretty knowledgeable and all that, right?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, I probably watch more than the average person, but I'm, you know, I enjoy the sport.
I'll give you a tip, Jim. They've got every Masters final round broadcast from CBS on YouTube going all the way back to 1968.
Wow.
So check those out because those are fabulous.
Michael,
I will definitely check that out
for hours. Okay, and you guys can beat movie and trivia like that. But anyway, all right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us today. Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks so much, Michael. We'll come back with another video like this soon, and we'll see y'all later. Have a great day. Bye-bye.